Pembina County, Dakota Territory, February 1878. The kind of morning that doesn't simply feel cold, it feels personal. The prairie wind moves like a living thing across the open flats, unbroken by trees or hills, gathering speed until it becomes a steady grinding pressure on every wall and window seam. At 47 miles per hour, it doesn't whistle politely. It moans, it hammers, it tests every latch as if it's trying to enter the home and take inventory of what you have left. Inside most cabins, families would be doing what you do when the world turns hostile, compressing life into the smallest warm radius. Bodies close to the stove, blankets pulled tight, children kept still to conserve heat. The fire becomes a second heartbeat, fed constantly, watched constantly. Because a weak flame on the Dakota prairie isn't just discomfort, it's danger. But at a small homestead near Cavalier Creek, the rhythm of survival looked different. A 34-year-old widow named Margareta Lindstrom stood in the center of her cabin floor with a spade in her hands. Not near the stove, not under a quilt. On the floorboards themselves, where everyone else would have avoided making a mess, she planted her boots and began to dig. It was the kind of act that makes neighbors pause in their chores, then linger at the doorway a little too long. The settlement around her 23 families of Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who had chased the promise of the Homestead Act had learned to read signs the way sailors read clouds. A cracked window pane, a sick calf, a stove that won't draw. Those were warnings. And a widow tearing up her own floor in the teeth of February looked like a warning too. To them, it didn't resemble planning. It resembled despair, like someone preparing a place to disappear. But Margareta wasn't disappearing. She was calculating. She had spent 3 years watching the prairie punish small mistakes until those mistakes became funerals. She knew how quickly wet wood turned into smoke, how quickly smoke turned into illness, how quickly illness turned into a grave on frozen ground. She wasn't digging because she'd lost her mind. She was digging because she intended to keep it, and because she was done letting the prairie decide who lived through the next winter. The Dakota prairie did not reward optimism. It rewarded preparation, precision, and an almost ruthless respect for physical limits. Winter here was not a season, it was a sustained test of systems. Heat, shelter, fuel. Fail one and the others followed. To survive a full prairie winter, every household needed wood. Not a little. Not a hopeful stack beside the door. At least 4 cords, nearly 5 tons of cut, split fuel just to maintain a livable interior when temperatures dropped past 30 below. And that wood did not grow nearby. The homestead sat on open grassland, treeless by design and by history. The nearest reliable timber, cottonwood and ash, stood 7 miles south along the Pembina River. Hauling it was brutal work, but hauling was only the beginning. The real enemy came afterward. Margareta had watched it happen year after year. Logs stacked carefully outside cabins in September absorbed autumn rain like sponges. October frost locked that moisture inside. November thaw loosened it just enough for mold and rot to begin. Then December froze everything solid again. By January, what looked like a proper woodpile was nothing more than water trapped in bark and fiber, heavy, cold, and useless. Wet wood doesn't burn. It smolders. It hisses. It fills a room with thick, oily smoke that clings to walls, lungs, and clothing. A stove fed with wet logs demands constant attention, but gives almost nothing back. The fire stays weak. The cabin stays damp. Condensation forms on windows, then freezes into opaque sheets of ice. Margareta knew the cost of that failure intimately. 2 winters earlier, she had watched her husband Henrik cough through the long nights. The roof leaked, the stove smoked, the air inside their cabin never fully dried. Pneumonia took hold quietly, the way it always does, first exhaustion, then fever, then the slow realization that rest alone would not fix this. Henrik died before spring. He had been a schoolteacher back in Kalmar County, Sweden, a man who believed that the world made sense if you paid close enough attention. In the evenings before the cold set in, he had explained things not as folklore, but as forces, how heat moves, how moisture behaves, why trapped dampness always wins in the end. He taught Margareta that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about understanding systems and refusing to fight physics with hope. Now, standing alone on the frontier, Margareta wasn't trying to beat the prairie. She was trying to cooperate with it on her terms. And it began by solving the problem no one else wanted to look directly at, where wood slept and what it absorbed while it waited. Margareta's answer did not point upward, it went down. Most homesteaders thought in terms of additions, another shed, a lean-to, a windbreak built hastily before snowfall. Everything was exposed, temporary fighting, the elements head-on. Margareta chose the opposite logic. If the prairie punished anything that stood against it, then the safest place to build was inside it. She wanted a subterranean vault. The first boards came up quietly, then the digging began. Heavy clay resisted every strike of the spade, dense and unyielding, each scoop requiring intention. Buckets of soil were hauled up through the open floor and carried outside their contents, vanishing into snowdrifts. The work was slow by necessity, 2 or 3 hours a day at most. Any longer and sweat would soak her clothes, a dangerous mistake in winter. It was during those early weeks that Thomas Arneson stopped by, a ship's carpenter from Bergen, Norway. He had framed hulls that crossed the North Atlantic and trusted wood more than theory. Watching Margareta hoist another bucket, he shook his head. "You're bringing damp into your home," he warned. "Earth holds moisture. That wood will mold before Christmas." Margareta didn't pause her rhythm. "Earth holds temperature too," she replied. "It stays steady down there, winter or summer." She was right. Beneath the frost line, the prairie did not swing wildly between extremes. It hovered near 50 degrees, a natural thermal reservoir, ignored by those who never thought to look below their boots. The chamber took shape deliberately, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep. Not arbitrary dimensions, but ones that balanced storage capacity with structural safety. This wasn't a pit. It was an engineered space. She sloped the floor at 3 degrees toward the back wall, carving a shallow channel that guided water toward a vertical shaft filled with river gravel. Any seepage followed gravity downward away from the wood. No pooling, no stagnation. Moisture given an easy exit rarely lingered. For the walls, she gathered 714 flat stones from Cavalier Creek, each one placed by hand, stacked without mortar. The gaps were intentional 1/4-inch spaces that allowed air to move slowly through the stone. Mortar trapped moisture and cracked in frost. Dry, stacked walls breathed. Margareta had learned that from watching Henrik's field fences survive winter after winter while plastered walls failed. What she was building wasn't radical chaos. It was quiet order, a system that acknowledged water temperature and air as partners rather than enemies. And beneath her floorboards, the prairie began to work for her instead of against her. The walls and floor solved only half the problem. Margareta knew that. Moisture doesn't just creep sideways through soil, it rises. Warm air carries it upward, invisible, but persistent, and without control, it would condense against the coldest surface it could find. If the ceiling failed, everything beneath it would eventually fail too. That ceiling became her greatest experiment. She began with juniper poles laid tightly across the width of the chamber, each chosen for its natural resistance to rot. Over them she wove a lattice of willow branches, flexible and forgiving, forming a mat that could flex slightly under pressure without cracking. It was a structure that distributed weight instead of resisting it, a lesson borrowed from baskets, not buildings. On top of this framework, she spread a mixture she refined through trial and memory. 3 parts clay soil, 2 parts dried prairie grass, 1 part ash from her stove. The clay provided mass. The grass added tensile strength and micro-channels for air. The ash altered the soil chemistry just enough to discourage mold and insects. It was not waterproof in the modern sense, and that was intentional. The layer behaved like a primitive vapor barrier, dense enough to shed liquid water, yet permeable enough to allow slow vapor movement. Moisture did not become trapped. It moved gradually, carried away by the same air currents that kept the chamber dry. Instead of sweating, the ceiling breathed. Above it all, Margareta replaced the cabin floor and framed a 30-inch trapdoor directly over the vault. She sealed the edges with strips of wool salvaged from an old coat, compressing them tightly so no drafts could slip through. The trapdoor fit snugly, invisible. Once closed, its presence betrayed only by the faintest seam in the planks. By late summer of 1878, the vault was ready, while the rest of the settlement watched the sky with growing unease, tracking clouds, counting days until harvest. Margareta was working indoors. She hauled in ash and elm properly seasoned and stacked it in a crosshatch pattern that allowed air to circulate freely around every log. 3.8 cords filled the chamber wall to wall. She wasn't just storing fuel, she was engaging a natural force known today as the stack effect. Warm air rising through the cabin would gently pull cooler, drier air from the vault below, wicking residual moisture out of the wood day after day. Where others fought dampness with constant labor, Margareta let physics handle it quietly. When the trapdoor closed for the final time, the cabin looked unchanged. But beneath the floorboards, a stable microclimate waited, ready to face whatever winter chose to throw at the prairie. The winter of 1878 to 79 did not arrive politely. It came in waves, each one erasing whatever confidence the previous season had left behind. October opened with 11 inches of relentless rain, enough to turn the prairie into a skin of mud that never fully dried. Every outdoor woodpile in Pembina County soaked through to the core. Logs split months earlier swelled and darkened their weight, doubling as they drank in the water. Then December closed the trap. On the night of the 18th, temperatures plunged to 31 below zero. The wind followed, driving hard from the northwest at 35 miles per hour. If anyone had measured it, the wind chill would have read near 65 below, a number beyond imagination, beyond language. At that cold breath crystallized midair. Frost formed inside cabins. Metal burned bare skin on contact. That was the night Thomas Arneson came to Margareta's door. The lamplight caught his face as he stepped inside, and what it revealed was not pride or skepticism anymore. It was exhaustion edged with fear. His wood would not burn. The stove smoked no matter how carefully he tended it. His cabin was filling with a gray haze that clawed at the throat. And his 4-year-old son Peter could not stop wheezing. Thomas did not lecture, he did not argue. He stood there in silence until Margareta understood why he had come. She said nothing about the months of digging. Nothing about warnings ignored. She simply crossed the room and lifted the trapdoor. Cold air spilled upward as the hatch opened, but what Thomas saw beneath it stopped him. A chamber that felt cool, not cold. Stacks of wood that looked pale, clean, almost weightless compared to the soggy logs outside his home. He lifted one piece and felt the difference immediately. Dry, solid, alive with stored energy. "Take what you need," Margareta said. "Neighbors don't charge for survival." Within the hour, Thomas's stove was drawing clean. The smoke thinned. Heat returned to the cabin. Peter's breathing eased, each rasp slowly giving way to sleep. Word traveled quietly after that night. No announcements, no speeches, just footsteps in snow and the soft sound of a trapdoor opening again and again. Margareta's vault had passed its trial, not as an idea, but as proof. In a winter that punished every weakness, something built beneath the floorboards had held firm, and a child was breathing because of it. Survival on the prairie was never an individual achievement for long. Anything that worked truly worked, spread quickly, carried by necessity rather than pride. By the end of that winter, Margareta Lindstrom was no longer seen as the widow who dug up her floor. She was the reason 14 families still had clear lungs and warm rooms when the snow finally began to retreat. She never announced her system. She didn't write instructions or demand recognition. She simply opened the trap door when someone knocked and let the results speak for themselves. Dry wood changed more than temperature. It changed posture. Voices softened, coughs disappeared, children slept through the night instead of waking, gasping for air. By spring, skepticism had evaporated, not because of persuasion, but because of observation. Real engineering, the kind born from paying attention to materials, weather, and cause and effect, had proven itself in the only way the frontier respected it: kept people alive. When the ground thawed enough to cut, the sound of digging began to echo across Cavalier Creek. It wasn't frantic this time. It was measured, planned. Men and women stopped by Margareta's cabin to look, to measure, to ask quiet questions. She answered plainly, never embellishing. Depth, drainage, airflow. Let gravity work. Let temperature stabilize. Each family adapted the idea to their own strengths. Thomas Arneson, thinking like a shipwright, built a vault 14 feet long with heavier stone courses at the base. Wilhelm Krauss, drawing on his military background, curved his walls slightly inward to distribute soil pressure more evenly. Katharina Biernad created a dual-purpose chamber firewood storage in winter, a cool dairy room in summer where milk stayed sweet days longer than before. By 1882, 19 of the 23 homesteads in the settlement had subterranean wood storage beneath their floors or barns. The prairie hadn't changed. The winters hadn't softened. What changed was the way people built. One widow's refusal to accept this is just how it's done, rewired the architectural instincts of an entire community. They stopped treating winter as an enemy to be endured and began designing systems that quietly absorbed its force. The prairie still tested them, but now beneath their feet lay something: steady spaces that worked whether anyone was watching or not. And in that quiet reliability, the settlement found something rarer than comfort. It found resilience that could be shared. Margareta Lindstrom lived long enough to see her idea stop being an exception and become an assumption. New homesteads dug storage below grade as naturally as they framed walls or pitched roofs. No one called it innovation anymore. It was simply how sensible people built when the land made the rules. She passed away in 1904 at the age of 60, having outlived the winter that once threatened to take everything from her. There was no monument raised in her name, no newspaper headline. Her legacy was quieter than that, embedded in stone soil, and habits passed from neighbor to neighbor. More than a century later, the ground remembered her work. In 2016, archaeologists from the University of North Dakota excavated the site of her original cabin near Cavalier Creek. What they expected to find were remnants, collapsed walls, shifted stones, evidence of a structure that had surrendered slowly to freeze and thaw. What they found instead was continuity. The dry stacked stone walls remained aligned. The drainage channel still guided water downward into gravel. Even the slope of the floor was intact, subtle but unmistakable. When they lowered instruments into the chamber on a July afternoon, 89 degrees above ground, the temperature inside stabilized at 52 degrees. 138 years later, the system was still functioning. Today, we use different language for what Margareta built. We call it earth-sheltered architecture, passive annual heat storage, thermal mass. We present it as modern discovery refined in laboratories and diagrams. But none of it is new. Margareta learned it by paying attention, by watching what failed, by understanding why, and by refusing to repeat the same mistake twice. Her vault wasn't clever, it was honest. It acknowledged gravity, moisture, and heat as constants rather than inconveniences. Her story endures because it carries a reminder we still need. The most durable solutions are rarely dramatic. They are often invisible, working patiently beneath our feet, long after the builder is gone. If we listen closely to the land, to history, to quiet competence, we find that survival is not about conquering nature. It is about building in ways that allow nature to do the heavy lifting. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is dig downward and trust what you understand.